Good evening or good afternoon. I'm Mike Cordner, head of theatre here in Theatre, Film and TV, and one of the directors of this show. We've got 3 on this one, which is lucky, since I did this to myself a little bit into rehearsals. This is the second time that we've done before one of the performances in the summer, a conversation with one of our departmental friends, Michael Billington, The Guardian's long-established theatre reviewer, but also author of a series of brilliant critical studies of both performance and of recent theatre, and a biographer just tucked under his arm as well, of above others, Peggy Ashcroft and Harold Pinter, invited by Harold Pinter, which this is a distinction but also a dangerous prospect, as it were. So we're going to explore putting restoration plays on today. And I immediately want to sort of do a caveat against the title, because this isn't a restoration play. One uses this label in a general way because that's how it's used. But strictly restoration plays are plays written during the reign of Charles II, which is 1660-85. And this is 10 years plus later, and after a revolution, the 1688 revolution, which changed the terms of thinking about, among other things, domesticity, marriage, and all the law that connected with that. So there's a problem immediately about even thinking about this period because it's such a long one.
Well, I think it's another problem. No, I mean, it's Staging Restoration Comedy Now is the title, isn't it? And when you asked me to take part in this, my thought immediately was, well, no one does restoration comedy now except your good self.
Strange places like here.
Yes. So I'm quite serious about this. I mean, as a theatre critic, I have gone over the last decade without seeing very rarely a professional production of a restoration comedy. The genre, the form, has fallen out of fashion. And so could I just briefly sort of talk about what's happened, I think, in the last sort of 60 years while I've been a conscious theatre goer. There was a period which I didn't see, even I'm not old enough to see, 1945, I would say, to about 1955 or 56, when obviously there were a number of vigorous restoration revivals, principally the West End, principally under the aegis of people like Binky Beaumont, obviously highly decorative, extravagantly costumed, beautifully cast. Edith Evans does A Way of the World, I think, in the 1940s, now playing Lady Wishfort, whereas before she'd played Millamant. John Gielgud does a production of Love for Love at the Haymarket, I think, in the late 1940s. A famous production of The Relapse, which I've read about with Cyril Ritchard, I think, wasn't there, in early 1950s, late 1940s. In other words, restoration comedy seemed to appeal to that post-war audience that was obviously bred in austerity and was, I presume, hungry for something that was gay in the old sense of the word, colourful, decorative, full of beautiful costumes, beautiful designs, and so forth. And the word that is associated with that period is camp. But I think, looking back at some of those casts, there must have been some absolutely scintillating performances, and I would have given my eye teeth to see, as you probably would, to see Edith Evans do Lady Wishfort, or John Gielgud play Valentine in Love for Love. So there was a vogue for about 10 years post-war for restoration comedy. And then I think the second thing that happens significant is in 1956, the Berliner Ensemble comes to the Palace Theatre in London for the first time. And that, I think, does more than anything to change post-war British theatre. And one of the plays they do is Brecht's adaptation of Farquhar's The Recruiting Officer, Trumpets and Drums, set in the American War of Independence. And that approach to the world of the Restoration, I think, changes the way English directors think about these plays. And the immediate consequence was when the National Theatre Company was established at the Old Vic, they started by importing productions from Chichester. The first sort of native production they do is what? It's The Recruiting Officer, directed by Bill Gaskell, a famous production with Maggie Smith, young Robert Stevens, Colin Blakely, Laurence Olivier, no less, playing Captain Brazen. I saw that production. Did you?
No, that's slightly before my time.
Slightly before your time, sorry. I was quite young, but yes. Yeah.
I was in Belfast.
But that, I think, taught us quite a lot, actually. I mean, partly the play itself requires, as you would agree, I'm sure, a degree of rural realism, doesn't it? And also accuracy about the dubious recruiting methods that were used. It's set in Shropshire, it takes us away from the hothouse world of London, etc. And I thought it was a magnificent production, actually, that realised the social and political values of the play. And I think that has a knock-on effect. Other directors also start to do Brechtian or pseudo-Brechtian productions of restoration comedy, and people start looking for the realism within this world. And then I think after that, you get a third phase where you get something of the glitter of the post-war era with rather sort of robust comic acting. The example I'm thinking of is Donald Sinden in The Relapse, which again is directed by Trevor Nunn in the early years of the RSC. A beautiful sort of black and silver production, I seem to remember, directed by, designed by Christopher Morley, yes, with Donald Sinden giving this wonderful performance as Lord Foppington and making the point, and this is crucial, as I'm sure we'd both agree, that Lord Foppington, although a fop, is actually extremely virile. Yes. I mean, Donald Sinden has extraordinary sort of Cupid's bow mouth, I remember, but this extremely deep, bass, guttural voice. So there was no doubt about his heterosexual inclinations, despite his fanciful costume. I mean, I'm describing this in some detail because I think we get these phases, the post-war phase, the Brechtian phase, the sort of early RSC phase of restoration comedy. And then gradually, we've shifted into a period like now, where these plays are falling into disuse in the professional theatre. And it seems to me we lack, I think, that kind of Brechtian urge to find the political reality behind the plays. I think, crucially, we also lack the actors who have that training to do these plays. Apart from Donald Sinden, the only actor I can think of who's made a sort of forte of this territory is Simon Russell Beale, who did a season, if you remember, at The Swan, where he played the lead in just about every restoration comedy they did. He did say I thought rather self-deprecatingly, I'm the RS's resident puff. That was his phrase. But what he was doing actually was showing that you can play restoration comedy and do it very well. But I think post-Sinden, post-Russell Beale, who now, which actors have the panache, the style, the capacity to take these plays on? So for for a variety of reasons, I think these plays are, say, falling by the wayside at the moment. I'm very grateful to have the chance to see this play tonight, which I have not seen professionally performed since 1980, I think I'm right in saying. But I think this is a cause for sadness that, A, we're losing sight of restoration comedy. And I mean, we can take this further if you like. I would go further and say I think the British classic tradition, other than Shakespeare, is at the moment hanging by a thread for a variety of reasons. I was brought up in a world where we were regularly exposed to the classic repertory. I think this is no longer the case for young people. We get a very narrow strip of the classic repertory. This sounds like a terrible sort of gloomy diatribe, which it is, actually. But why is it, do you think, that we're not doing restoration comedy in the way we did in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s? What's the reason?
On the back of a postcard?
Yeah. Well, on a long postcard.
I think there's a whole series of separate reasons. I think both national companies, who are the prime custodians of this, that's what they're funded to do, it's one of their functions, are actually badly managed. I think there's a history here. The National Theatre had a very, very sensational literary manager in its first decade, Kenneth Tynan, who did many, many good things, but I think he's brought into a degree of disrepute because his career ended in a kind of scandal, and certainly acrimony within the company. The idea of having that kind of powerful man, a dramaturg of that kind of authority, who could actually say there are these vast areas of the repertory that you, the artistic director, who is frantically running a building, trying to do 3 productions probably a year, tending to all kinds of attention-grabbing problems, haven't got the time to find time about, I will lead you there. We don't really have a dramaturgical tradition here. We had it briefly. Ronald Brydon did it for a time at the Royal Shakespeare Company in the late 60s, early 70s, at a time when they really extended the repertory, and not just into this period, but into Russian theatre, into a range of Gorky that hadn't been done in England, to Boucicault's London Assurance, which they made a vast hit of, and no one had thought could possibly be revived to a success.
Wild Oats.
Yep.
Yes, all those bits.
Yeah. And what we now get is a theatre in London, in the National Theatre, which by and large lives off those days. So Heitner looks and thinks he should do a 19th century comedy. Oh, we'll do London Assurance again. And he does it in a much inferior way to the earlier production. There's a sort of repetition happening rather than foraging. So there seems to be an intellectual inertia in both big companies. For a time, the RSC just abandoned this repertory. They're now beginning, well, they professed a commitment to go back. I know you've got some problems, we might talk about that in a moment too, about how they're actually delivering on that, but they say they're going into it. So there's not been energy in the companies to explore. There is a problem about actors' training. I think drama schools don't begin to equip them actually vocally, whatever the repertory is, well enough to handle thoughts that take long sentences.
Yes.
They're actually geared to short sentences, lots of full stops, basically, that kind of acting. Where a lot of the acting happens between dialogue, not through dialogue. We've been inveighing like two old men in talking beforehand. How often we simply hear misemphasis on the stage, where it's quite obvious where the critical point of a sentence is, and it's missed. You had one which is one of the most famous lines in Restoration comedy.
Well, yes, I mean, I think the last Restoration comedy I saw was a production of The Way of the World at the Sheffield Crucible, directed by Lindsay Turner, who was a very good young director, actually, and it was a very physically lively production. But there's a famous scene where Millamant, the heroine, establishes the conditions by which she might agree to marry Mirabell. And it builds this wonderful, wonderful last line, and she says, I may by degrees dwindle into a wife. Well, dwindle is the word, isn't it? I mean, that's a magnificent choice of word. So what did the actress do? I may by degrees dwindle into a wife. You know, she hit the wrong word in the sentence. The tune was wrong. And that's simply, I don't know, it's the director and the actor, really, not listening to the text and listening to where the emphases lie. Just picking up on what you said about the National Theatre's choice of repertory, and the fact that Tynan, you think, had this influence, and then he left this sort of vacuum. But I think the reason Tynan had that influence as the dramaturg or literary manager at the National was, A, because it was the beginnings of the company, wasn't it? Yes. And secondly, this is crucial, Laurence Olivier, as the director, felt, I think, conscious of his lack of historical knowledge of world drama, to put it crudely. And so Tynan was asked to come up with a list, I think, of something like 1,000 world-famous plays that the National should do. And I think that list is still there in the offices, and they use it. But once Olivier passed over the National Theatre, it then became Peter Hall, Trevor Nunn, Peter Hall, Richard Eyre, Trevor Nunn, Nick Heitner, all Cambridge English graduates, actually, who felt the dramaturg was therefore slightly superfluous to requirements. They didn't need someone to tell them, they thought, what the key plays were. Yes. So I think that's why the balance of power between the literary department and the director has changed within the National Theatre. I would agree with you, though. I think people don't forage, to use your word. And my criticism of directors today is not that they lack talent. I mean, I think we're swimming with talent in the British theatre in terms of directors. My complaint is they don't read enough plays. They haven't explored the repertory sufficiently to know what needs to be done. But this restoration dearth is a very specific issue, isn't it? And it seems to me, it still puzzles me why there has been in the last decade this abandonment of these plays. Is it because we don't have the actors with the capacity to do it? Is it because we're nervous of recreating this particular society?
Well, we have had in the same period, though, a great phase of interesting plays about the second half of the 17th century. I mean, Playhouse Creatures through to Restoration and onwards,
Yes.
And Victory. And, I mean, some of the key texts
are about this period.
Yeah. So it's not the period. It's something about, it seems, what people think the period requires in terms of performance. I mean, again, I was inveighing against this beforehand. I think there's a false tradition about how you're supposed to do these plays. And it was generated in the basically, these plays fell out of the repertory in the 19th century. And they came back post the First World War through a lot of pioneering productions which changed them out. But they were, again, I don't mean gay, but they were camp productions. They were productions that put an inordinate investment into the fact that you had to stand at a particular kind of angle, because that's how a Restoration gentleman
and wield the fan in a specific way.
Well, and those lace cuffs and so on.
Yeah.
And all of this is rubbish. It's ahistorical rubbish. There is no reason to think that restoration performance was of that kind. What they're doing at best is to take conduct books, manuals for how to behave from the period, and presuming that that represented how people did in reality behave. But how to make yourself better books feed off the fact that most of the people who buy them aren't actually behaving like that. And restoration theatre is mainly about bad behaviour rather than good, indecorous rather than decorous, or at least the points when the fault lines begin to show. But that has been imposed in a very big way, and you can still buy books that tell you how to do restoration theatre that effectively start with deportment, and a deportment which is imposed and stifles. And I think there is a bad reputation about restoration theatre, that it actually imposes these demands.
But I thought we were getting away from that tradition of fluttering of fans, and immaculate costumes and everything being prettified. I thought the whole point of that, as I said, post-1956 revolution was to get away from that in productions like The Recruiting Officer, a production I liked, you didn't, Peter Wood's Love for Love at the National Theatre.
Well, that's where we do divide, yeah.
Yeah. And also, what also strikes me is we had the actors who could undertake these plays. I mean, I would just pick out two performances, both by Laurence Olivier, in the two productions I've just mentioned. Neither was the major role, was it? But what he did was to take a supposedly minor character and turn it into the most extraordinary virtuosic display. He played Captain Plume in The Recruiting Officer,
Brazen.
didn't he? Sorry, Captain Brazen. Captain Brazen. Who is a sort of a leech, a parasite, a braggart, etc., etc. And Olivier played him with a kind of, it was a muscular camp, if it was camp at all. There's a famous moment when he kisses Robert Stevens as Captain Plume. They embrace heartily, centre stage. And I've never forgotten this. As they kissed, Olivier just raised his right leg, in excitement, as if he was getting a secret sexual thrill from this. The other moment I remember is in Love for Love, when he played Tattle, who is, again, this slightly epicene, gossipy, malicious figure. And at one point, Olivier, do you remember? Did you
I saw it. Yeah.
There was a wall. I always remember this across the back of the stage, and there was a slight gap in the wall. And Olivier was walking along, prancing along the top of this wall, and had to make a leap across this gap. And he drew back in hesitation, as if in terror of having to risk his beautiful costume and beautiful, deportment by doing this. I mean, it was just beautiful, subtle character acting. And I rather miss that sort of acting these days.
I think that, but I think there's a big distinction to draw between those two performances.
Yes.
I've only read about and seen what's preserved in archives of The Recruiting Officer, but it seems to be because you had a director who on the right occasion is a genius, William Gaskell, controlling that, absolutely in control, and holding Olivier's invention in place while encouraging it to the appropriate amount. And the Tynan log of the production is fascinating that way. He's got one where he says that Gaskell forced them all to improvise.
Yes.
And quite a lot of the company had never improvised, including Olivier.
Yes.
And Olivier obviously doesn't want to do it. And then he throws himself into it. And once he's into the game, he's going to win. So Tynan says he discovers things about Brazen that Farquhar didn't know. And that's fine, but that seems dangerous as well, somewhere around there. And it seems to me that in negotiations that follow, Gaskell always keeps him the right side of that line. Now, it seemed to me that in Love for Love, which I did see, he was out of control, because Tattle became almost the lead character in scenes where he is not the lead character. And that's always a danger if you cast the greatest actor in the company in a support role, and especially if you have an actor who's not very tall, manages to get the highest heels on stage, who in a production that was using quite a lot of dun colours is in yellow, and so on. There was a star intervention.
And I remember also he had very bulging calves, which no one else did. So but that's an act of genius, isn't it? Investing a character with a lot of detail.
But that's the difference for me between the two productions, that one is an indulgent production, and a Shaftesbury Avenue production in the end, and hasn't got a grasp on the play, finally. What it's got, because it was an extraordinary cast. Albert Finney was in it, Geraldine McEwen was in it, then Redgrave, Miles Mallison, almost his last time on stage. They're all going off like firecrackers, so you've got a production which everyone is going to enjoy, but there's actually no central grasp there of the kind that you get in the time, in the Gaskell. I agree, the Gaskell, the two productions by him of Farquhar, the Bow Stratagem as well, almost 10 years later. And then the Congreve at Stratford, at Chichester, the Way of the World.
Yes.
Those three have a grasp and a precision that's unusual, but they're not a trend. And I don't think there was a school of Gaskell.
But why is Love for Love, for example, neglected? I mean, you know this, but the audience doesn't. I mean, I'm currently writing a book on the 100 greatest plays,
Which will
is quite an
transform the
arrogant...
repertory.
Oh, sorry?
Would transform the repertory.
Well, no, I don't think so. But it's quite an arrogant thing to do, you know, and obviously I'm going to be in huge trouble once people know what my 100 greatest plays are.
I can see the reviews coming.
Yes, so can I. I incautiously revealed my Shakespeare list to someone, and that caused terrible ructions, actually. I was a pariah in Stratford-on-Avon for a week afterwards. But anyway, but I have put Love for Love down, number 27, I can tell you, on the list. And, you know, reading it again, I thought...
Actually,
this is
higher, surely.
Well, no, this is chronological.
No.
Chronological. I thought what a magnificent play this is, actually, because it has a sweetness of spirit, a generosity of spirit behind it. It also has, you know, the beauty of that prose. It has a character, Valentine, who undergoes a transformation in the course of the action. It's got wonderful sort of minor characters. His brother, who speaks entirely in nautical metaphors. I mean, this is one of the richest plays in the canon, in the English language. And yet, when do we see it? Hardly at all. Something is going wrong, it seems to me, with a theatre that doesn't embrace its past. And I mean, I don't want to sound like a grumpy old man, like I hope I'm not. But it does worry me that it's not simply the restoration segment of the canon that's falling into disrepair. It's the classical canon, other than Shakespeare, is either falling into disuse, or if it is being revived at all, is being revived in a way that I find increasingly narcissistic. In the assumption is that every play written in the past is actually about us today in some mysterious way. And I mean, you mentioned Stratford-on-Avon. I feel this year in The Swan, you know, I've seen 2 Elizabethan Jacobean plays, both of which have been rather gratuitously, in my book, updated to make them reflect our own culture and our own society. And I think, what has happened to a theatre that was happy to re-examine the past and locate plays in the period in which they were written? What do you feel about that?
No, I think that's happening. I feel nervous, though, sitting in front of a modern set.
Because you've relocated this one?
Yeah, to today, yes.
Yes, right.
Yeah, so,
well, we shall see.
Yeah. There should be a continuation of this conversation after the performance tonight,
yes, sure,
here on the stage, but we're not offering that. There are different ways, I hope, of modernising. And I hope that we haven't made this narcissistic reflection of ourselves. I have moved across the course of directing plays from leaving things in their own period, and just that was my default assumption, you did that, to, by and large, looking for plays that I feel I can locate now. And that is partly, I suppose, at some level, a surrender, knowing that the actors I work with will find that easier. You know, the coordinates are clear. It's also a simply technical thing, finally getting disgusted with the amount of time in the last 10 days of a show that, if you're doing it in period, goes simply in getting all of that right, at a time when I want to be working very closely with the actors, and that's just not a cost I'm prepared to pay anymore. But it does feel also that something has happened in the times, and that it's quite a statement to insist that a play has to be 1697 any longer. And I feel double thoughts about that. Am I being craven? Am I, being pragmatic? But I do choose plays that I think will absolutely naturally bear that strain, and still, I hope, remain to a degree strange. That there are things we haven't done in this one that we have done in other shows. For example, 4 years ago in Mad World, my masters, we modernised all the money. We converted all the amounts.
But did you keep it in period?
No, we updated it, but we actually changed all the money so that it worked now. And actually, 18 months ago, the Merry Wives at Stratford on the main stage, they had it updated, but they didn't change any of the money. So people were saying, good God, £200? And I suddenly thought, the audience perfectly well knows this is an Elizabethan play, so you don't need to change this if you do it in the right way. So we hope that we've got a production which, as it were, exists in 2 time zones, but because it's in modern dress, explains itself more clearly, more directly to the audience.
But do you think there is and should be perhaps a double standard? I have no objection whatsoever to most of Shakespeare's plays being updated, certainly the comedies and the tragedies, transposed to another culture, another period. And more often than not, I find this enlightening. I find with the histories, it is a huge problem. I think if a play is called Richard II, then it is defining the period in which it is set. it's with the less familiar classic repertory. If an audience comes to play like Arden and Faversham, take an obvious example, and doesn't know the play, I feel they're still not getting the play somehow. If it's being transposed to Essex, in the present.
I was supposed to see it, and then I did this, so I haven't seen it
That's
yet.
a random example.
Well, the photographs are very modern, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I think that it's always a particular problem, isn't it? It's whether this play will yield or gain from the transposition. Arden is set in a very particular kind of circa 1590 mercantile community.
But isn't
and
one
the
of
coordinates
Yes.
are difficult, I would have thought, to map onto now.
Isn't part of the fun of directing plays excavation? I mean, you're a scholar. You have spent your life
Excavating.
excavating the past. Seriously, though, excavating the period in which these plays are
Yes,
set.
sure.
I mean, I quoted this to you earlier. Years ago, I used to know the German director, Peter Stein. And he once said to me, he said, the fun of being a director is that everything he does is a research project. And he said it's a way of educating himself in, the pictorial art, the social conditions of whatever play he did. And very famously, of course, they have huge amounts of money in Germany. When he started to do Shakespeare at the Berlin Schaubühne, he actually brought his company to Stratford-on-Avon to live for about 5 or 6 weeks. So they got to know the Stratford-on-Avon countryside, to find out the world in which Shakespeare lived and grew up. I mean, that's an idealistic way of doing it, but that seems to be part of the fun of directing, to immerse yourself in the time period in which the play is set.
Well,
but all I'm saying is, generally speaking, directors do that less and less and less.
Well, I mean, with this one, this is very specifically a post-revolutionary play.
Yeah.
It allows its characters to think in terms of the key words of the revolution. For example, at one point, a street riot begins with people crashing off stage saying liberty and property. And they've obviously got a rather odd notion of liberty and property, since they're about to thieve other people's. But it's playing games with that. And we've tried to find coordinates for that now, which will actually make
so what do
that
they
come
say?
out.
What do they say instead of liberty and property?
Oh, no, they say that.
Oh, they say that,
They say
right.
that. No, there's a quarrel from last year that I change words, and I was told last year that we want you to stick closer to the text than that. I'm afraid we have done that this time, though not to the extent that we did with Dutch Courtesan, because the challenge of the two plays is different. Dutch Courtesan is written by a man who's mad about bending words, twisting, contorting them, and we left a lot of that in place. But there were moments where we felt that it went so far that a modern audience simply wouldn't be following the story, so we changed it. But here we've done simpler things. I gave an example beforehand, which was there's a crucial reference to cold tea.
Yes.
In Vanbrugh, which is slang for brandy. So it does seem to me important that we change that to brandy, because the play is about to go west otherwise. But we also find problems with things like there's a line about a wife being likely to tell her husband that someone else has made love to her, which means courted her, not that they've had sex. And so we've changed that. So lots of coordinates of that
But that
kind.
phrase, made love to it, recurs to English literature, doesn't it? Well into the 20th century, and people meant something different from what we mean by it. So that phrase has always been a rather equivocal phrase. But I'm still interested in the general, what I see as the cultural phenomenon. I mean, here you are, you have this magnificent department at university, and all the facilities, and you do investigate the world repertory and the English repertory, I know that, but why in general is there this fear of the plays of the past, and not only the plays of the past, the culture of the past, it seems to me, as if everything has to be a reflection of the eternal present, and we seem to live maniacally in this constant present, and every work of the past has to be somehow related to us today. That's what I find odd and puzzling and dismaying in lots of ways, actually.
Well, that's a vast indictment of a culture.
Well, it is an indictment of the culture,
specific,
and I'm asking, but I'm puzzled.
But what would you, in specific terms, then do if you were directing a play from the Jacobean and the Restoration?
What would I do?
Well, I mean, would you, for example, say not update? But because there are ways of updating that I hope keep the sense of strangeness.
Yes.
And there are ways of updating that simply say what kind of modern remapping can we do so that it feels like this or that. We have a joke in the company, Made in Chelsea. This is what we're not avoiding. There's a remark in the programme about that. So we don't make it Made in Chelsea, as it were. Yeah. So we don't absolutely just say, you understand it, you'll like it because it's like this.
Yeah.
The kind of thing that some theatres now do, don't they? If you like so-and-so, you'll like this, as it were. We absolutely do not wish to do that. We wish this play in some ways to feel strange, but we are choosing to use now as a way of making it at least explicable.
You say, what would I do? I mean, in fact, I'm sounding a terrible absolutist. I'm much more pragmatic, I think, as a critic, than I sound. And I mean, in the end, I think there's no absolute right and there's no absolute wrong, and I judge every production on its merits. And what I judge is the intelligence and detail with which the transposition has been carried out. And sometimes these transpositions can be absolutely revelatory. Sometimes they can simply be provocative. I mean, I happened to see this week in Regent's Park that old English classic, Hobson's Choice, written in 1916, set in the 1880s, and in this version set in the 1960s. And it was all very jolly, and the audience had a jolly night out, and everyone went away looking happy. But I thought there's something odd about a play, that's actually set in the 1880s and is dealing with a sort of tyrannical patriarch. If you put it in the 1960s, why are these daughters so terrified of their father? Why does he have to make a financial settlement on them? And I thought the director hadn't really thought through all the implications of setting it in the 1960s. But because it was the 60s and it was the twist and miniskirts and lots of nice music, everyone went away feeling very happy. But I was just sort of nagged by this feeling. It doesn't actually make total sense. And I think with any transposition, the question I'm asking is, does it actually fit the particular text? And that's what I should be asking myself this evening, actually. Yes.
Do you write notes? I remember one of the first productions I felt that transposed a play that I saw into another period, where actually there was sheer gain. This is quite a long time ago. This is John Barton's production of Othello at Stratford.
Yes.
Slightly overshadowed by the Olivier having come recently before it, and to some degree wounded by having an Othello who was a wonderful actor, but that was not his role.
Yeah.
But it did wonderful. It transposed it to mid-Victorian
and a garrison
times.
town, I remember, isn't it? Yes.
And the sheer gain, for example, that when Cassio was dismissed, sacked, he had to come back and plead for his job, not in uniform, in civvies. Mm-hmm. And it ached. So when he's talking about reputation, just being in those clothes and having to walk into a military community, we knew that, we understood that. I don't know whether a modern audience would, but that audience then did. So that told me that transpositions can actually clarify something which in Jacobean costume never works.
Yes.
Cassios tend to emote about what's been happening to them, and they don't actually have any basis within the imagined world of the play to really communicate that to us. It didn't work in the national one, I thought. He was quite a good Cassio, but I thought the loss of status didn't come across.
I think with Shakespeare, we both lived through a sort of generations, decades, haven't we, of consistent transposition, updating of the plays, sometimes crass, but on the whole, I think beneficial. And I sometimes enjoy the most radical transpositions. I mean, I thought Rupert Gould's transposition of The Merchant of Venice to Las Vegas was actually brilliant in lots of ways. You're wincing as I say this, actually.
That's another quarrel.
Well, I thought actually the idea of Shylock as a casino sort of bigwig, who actually, I thought a brilliant little touch, either from the director or the actor Patrick Stewart, was that he was in his office and he was always playing golf with a glass, an ordinary glass. And I thought, yes, he's a golfer, but he's not allowed, of course, because he's a Jew, to join the local Las Vegas golf clubs. That was one example, I thought, of intelligent thinking through. And the image at the end of that poor woman, Portia, who always seems to be in an unhappy predicament at the end of that play, actually. With a gay husband, she's only just really acknowledged this fact. She's only found out really in the trial scene, I think. And in a sort of state of emotional solitude with someone singing Elvis's Are You Lonesome Tonight in the background. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. I thought it worked perfectly. But that was because it had been thought through. What I think I'm against are those sort of casual updatings where the director hasn't worked out the implications.
But you were also after narcissism, which is a slightly different thing, isn't it? I mean, it could have been worked out perfectly well.
Yes.
But you feel that the strangeness of the thing is being collapsed into an easy familiarity, right?
Well, yes, when I use narcissism, it's a big word. I remember reading years ago Nabokov's lectures on literature, years and years ago. But he says something interesting in those, and he was teaching American students, wasn't he, at an American university at this point. And in these lectures, he says the great danger with literature is always asking the question, how does it relate to us now, rather than making an imaginative leap into the period in which the actual book was written. And it's a serious point, actually. And all I'm generally saying is, as a culture, I think in the theatre, we're less prone now to make those leaps into 200, 300 years ago and to ask what life was like then, because we want every play now to be about us in some way, or a reflection of our predicament, our problems, our dilemmas.
It might be romanticising the past a wee bit, though. I mean, productions in the past might automatically have assumed, as the Gielgud one did, if you're doing Love for Love, you will put it roughly in its own period. A slightly imaginative version of the 1690s. Does it do more than that? Does it really think about the strangeness of the play and its underlying assumptions? Hasn't it already coated it with a style that makes you comfortable?
You're right. I mean, you can have lazy productions that look authentic but aren't. And you can have lazy productions that update it but haven't thought it through. What I'm asking for is a director or directors who actually investigate the past, or if they do transpose it, have investigated the chosen period. Jonathan Miller, has really made his directorial reputation, didn't he, out of transpositions? But at least he always immersed himself, it seems to me, in the literature, the pictures, the art of that period. So what I'm asking for is kind of a directorial logic to any transposition.
Well, as a person who's grubbed in the archives, as it were, but one of the things that fascinates me, and which I think by and large modern performance doesn't take into account in any serious way, is the difference in playing space and therefore playing conventions, but both broadly between, let's say, 17th century circumstances now, but then also between different theatre periods, but also different playhouses in the period. We've designed it in a completely different way than we've ever designed for this space before, because what we wanted was a big naked space that takes the actors out into the middle of the audience. They're going to have very few props. There are 3 chairs used in the show, 3 stools, 1 bar table, 1 bench. The rest of the time they're out here in space, because that's how the restoration stage worked. You had a proscenium arch, as we do, and you, in front of that there was an apron which could be as deep as 20 feet. So you could have set opening on sliding grooves, actors revealed, and we've got contemporary accounts that say the actors came forward as fast as they could, as common sense would suggest, because if you're trying to play from behind a proscenium with 20 feet of bare stage in front of you to an audience, you haven't got control.
To bring the action forward.
Yeah.
Right.
So we don't literally bring it forward here, but we actually try to make them communicate out right round. So we've tried to find an arena which is completely modern in its design, doesn't look at all like a restoration playhouse, but reproduces some of the qualities of interaction with the audience. Because it seems to me one of the great things about the restoration tradition is that texts generate very precise senses of how people are engaging with each other, interrogating each other, undermining each other, but absolutely automatically and easily include the audience in that dialogue. Aside markings actually mislead, because asides are another category within the fact that everyone on stage always knows there's an audience watching and actually pulls them in. So we wanted that, and I don't think The Swan, for example, is designed production by production in ways which think, how does this play have impacted inside it the performance circumstances for which the playwright knew he was writing.
I just found it strange that this wonderful play, which we're about to see, again, is so rarely done. Because if you look at the content of the play, a poisoned marriage, sexual relations that are tainted, etc. Yeah. It seems so apropos, doesn't it?
Also, the weird thing is, The Relapse doesn't get done that often, his other great play, but it's a monster of a play. Yeah. It requires an inordinately large cast and phenomenal resources, whereas this one is deliberately more small scale and domestic. It has at its centre 8 large parts, and then a number of much smaller parts. So it's much more doable.
But a lot of it could be Strindberg, it seems to me, couldn't it?
Oh, yeah. There are cruel lines in this play.
Yes, and yet we are shy of doing these plays outside, institutions like this one. I come back to where we started, really, which is I'm bewildered at this sort of neglect of restoration comedy, whether it's because we lack the knowledge, whether it's because we lack the actors or the directors to do it. I'm not sure. But thank God, the plays are done here anyway.
The theatre has... The theatre keeps saying we're going to do it different this time, but in its choices is constantly dictated by an oppressive knowledge of what's happened in the past.
Yes.
And so Provoked Wife's last major production was at the National Theatre in
1980? Yeah.
And we may disagree about this one. I thought it was a catastrophe.
That's putting it a bit strongly, I think.
I thought you got every... No, I'm prepared to defend it. We can go out and around.
Yes.
It's the central character, without revealing too much of what's going to come tonight, is a woman who starts behind a mask and slowly learns to talk about herself and let more of it. I share it with others, select body of others. He cast Geraldine McEwen in that role. Affectation incarnate, in exactly the wrong role. Whereas as the affected lady in the play, Lady Fanciful, he cast a now dead but wonderful actress, Dorothy Tewton, whose power was all to do with the hint that powerful emotion was about to come out. She was already declining in powers because of illness by then.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yes.
10 years earlier, she'd have been the ideal lead. And in The Husband, whose name is Sir John Brute, and some of his behaviour lives up entirely to that surname, he cast one of the most refined actors in the English theatre, terribly cerebral, witty, John Wood. His central castings were suggested he didn't understand the play. He then topped it off by enormous decoration. A scene that is really quite simple, takes place in St James's Park in the original, involves a series of trios and duets. He set, if you remember, on the Thames frozen,
Yes.
with skaters going by, some of the characters skating on, others waiting forlornly on a wharf for a boat that was never going to come. Because, the whole thing decorated beyond madness. And also, there's one of my favourite scenes, which I won't identify too much in case when you see it you don't enjoy it as much as I do, actually involves some jokes about the audience. And it's built totally for the circumstances of the Restoration stage, which is, as I described, you're out there among the audience, you've got boxes either side, you've got people down there at your feet, you've got people up there, you're right in among them. The lighting is the same chandelier that lights the audience, so it's more like cabaret, right? He staged this on a very ornate three-walled set with a four-poster bed inclined away from the audience, with the two actresses cuddling each other among pillows and giggling to each other. So none of the lines impacted in the way they were meant to do, because the actors were meant to be staring at the audience and saying, you know what I'm talking about, this is what you're feeling.
So you didn't like it?
I didn't know. I thought I'd just get that out.
Yes, quite,
I thought
yes.
yes.
Obviously for 34 years this production has burned
This has been
in your
waiting.
memory,
This has
hasn't
been
it, actually? And now is your chance to rectify this.
Which, looking at the timing,
Yes.
might be a perfect bow out. Yeah, I'm afraid we have to conclude at past because we have to get the stage ready for your performance, which we hope you're coming to later this evening. But thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. Thank you. Thank you.